It's good to be with you again, and I know this is the moment that you've all been waiting for. The moment when David, the handsome young shepherd, strides out onto the stage to face the fearsome giant and slays him. This is justifiably one of the world's great stories, with its strong appeal to the imagination. It's a story of contrast: small against huge, weak against strong, youth against experience, beauty against the beast, underdog against the overwhelming favourite, and the underdog wins. Now, I loved this story as a boy, just like many others. I could picture myself as David courageously taking on and slaying my giants, whoever my giants happened to be. This, of course, changed every time I thought about the story and as I got older. And today, even today, this story, David versus Goliath, is a regular metaphor that's used particularly when there is a mismatch in sport or politics or in business. It's Northern Ireland against Brazil. It's the rebel alliance against the evil empire. It's Erin Brockovich against Pacific Gas and Electric in that famous movie. It's Wilberforce against the slave trade. And preachers also love this story, although they find wildly different interpretations and applications of it. What are the giants in your life? Satan? Fear? Lust? Anger? Low self-esteem? What about the 5 smooth stones that David took from the river? Do they represent something? Faith, hope, love, discipline, courage? Is any of that what this story is actually about? Let's for a moment try to forget the myths, secular and Christian, that surround the story, and allow the details of the actual text to shape our thinking. This was a key moment in Israel's history, for their survival was under threat from the Philistines. The Philistines were a sea people who settled on the south coast of Canaan, establishing 5 major cities. They gave their name, in fact, to the land. Palestine means the land of the Philistines. They also give their name to anyone thought not to be well educated, especially anyone who doesn't appreciate the arts, which has led to the impression that the Philistines themselves were primitive and unsophisticated, which is simply not the case, as recent archaeology has demonstrated. But the Philistines were a real thorn in the flesh for Israel at this time in history. And chapter 17 starts off by describing how the Philistines had gathered their forces for war against Israel. Israel deployed their forces on one hill, Philistines deployed their forces on the other hill, and in between was the valley of Elah. From the Philistine ranks every day, morning and evening, a giant of a man stepped forward, challenging Israel to put forward their own champion, so that instead of a full-blown war between the two armies, the issue could be settled by the two champions fighting each other, with the winner taking all. This was a known convention at the times, including here in Ireland. And for 40 days this went on, Goliath taunting Israel, but with no champion daring to step from the ranks of Israel to face him. Saul, along with the rest of the army, was terrified, and King Saul basically stayed in his tent, his knees knocking, unable to face the enemy. So the question then is, why? Why could they not find a champion? Why in particular was Saul not able to face Goliath? Well, the text first of all concentrates on the detail of Goliath's impressive height, his impressive armor and weaponry. He was at least almost 7 foot tall, possibly more. The ancient texts differ on this point. But he towered above everyone else, when the average height for a male at the time was around 5'6". His armor weighed over 50 kilos. The spear shaft that he carried was like a junior telegraph pole. The business end of it weighed 7 kilos. It was enormous. And of course, this focus of the text should trigger a memory for us, because it isn't the first time we've come across a reference to height and impressive physical appearance in this history. Saul himself was a head taller, we're told, than anyone else in the land. So when the people decided that the answer to their problems was to have a king rather than to wait on God as their king, and God presented them with Saul, he seemed to most people absolutely the ideal choice. He looked the part. He was a big man, a man to look up for, a man you could place your confidence in, a man to lead and deal with your enemies. And for a while, of course, it seemed to work. Saul routed the Amalekites, for example. But the problem is that if your confidence is in a big man, what do you do when you face an even bigger man? If all of your confidence is in human intelligence and skill and technology, size and power, everything's fine until you meet an even bigger, more impressive human being, someone more powerful, more intelligent. Then what do you do? The issue then of this story is not ultimately about physical size or tactics or superior weaponry. It was about where they placed their confidence. Paul's confidence, or Saul's confidence, I should say, was in himself, in his size, in his leadership ability, and his skill. And then he met someone bigger than him, and he was lost. I have a great deal of sympathy for Saul. And God tried everything he could with him, but to no avail. He wasn't prepared to wait on the Lord, to depend on him. When put to the test, he relied on his own wisdom and resource. He relied also on his position and power and authority as king, on being the big man, almost to the point of causing the destruction of his entire army, because he issued a completely unnecessary order forbidding any soldier to eat until, as Saul put it, I am avenged of my enemies. In other words, it wasn't about God and God's enemies at all. It was all about Saul and Saul's enemies. He even ordered that his own son, Jonathan, heir to his throne, should be put to death because he had eaten some honey to keep up his strength in the battle. Such foolish pride. Fortunately, in that incident, the army had had enough and Jonathan's life was spared. Now Saul found himself facing a man who thought exactly the same way as he did, a man whose confidence was in himself, in his size and strength and military prowess, a big man, much bigger than Saul, and Saul had no answer. He was terrified, which of course is what happens when people lose their confidence in the living God. But David was different, and we need to ask the same question. Why was David so different? Why was he able to face Goliath when Saul wasn't? David had been sent up to the battle by his father because 3 of David's older brothers had enlisted in the army, and he therefore, when he visited to bring food to his brothers, he heard Goliath taunting Israel. And he was appalled by what he heard. He couldn't understand how this man, this uncircumcised Philistine, as he called him, could be allowed to get away with it day after day, taunting God's people. Of course, his brothers put this down to his youth and his inexperience. But David's concern was genuine and deep and persistent, and so much so that it got him noticed. This talk was very different from the talk of anyone else, and eventually he was brought before the king. And he said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Of course, Saul responded, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a youth, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David's desire to face Goliath was not based on youthful ignorance and bravado. And it now emerges from what David told Saul that he had his own personal history of learning to trust God, of experiencing God in the battles he faced in his own personal life as a shepherd on the hillside. He had fought battles, not against human warriors, but against a lion and a bear, and had prevailed in those battles. He had experience of fighting in the course of his daily work, looking after sheep, where there was no one to watch, no one to witness, no one to applaud, no one except God himself. And what's more, David didn't put down his victories in those battles to his own superior strength and skill. It was the hand of the Lord. It was God's intervention. So David had learned in his personal life, in the context of his daily work, in fact, to trust the Lord, to rely on him. He had experienced the intervention of God in his personal life. So David's willingness to go against Goliath had nothing to do with his personal size, with feeling superior in any way. David wasn't looking for an impossible fight, but Goliath had defied the living God, and that David wasn't prepared to take. He was ready to stand up and fight for the reality of the God who lives, with the confidence that the God who had delivered him from the lion and the bear would deliver him from the hand of this Philistine. Saul, greatly to his credit, because he hadn't heard words of faith like this before, faith in the living of God, not in a long time anyway, he said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." But then Saul couldn't help being Saul. He couldn't help looking at the fight still from the natural point of view. David had no armor. How could he possibly achieve anything? And so he said to David, "Look, take my armor with you." David tried it, but then, fortunately, he discarded it. It would have been a disaster. There's nothing wrong with armor, but it was Saul's armor. It wasn't David's armor. He hadn't proved it. He hadn't trained in it. It was outside his experience and outside his experience of God. And so he turned to what he knew. He turned to what he had trained in, a sling and 5 stones that he chose from the little stream. When he then came out to face Goliath, Goliath roared with laughter mixed with anger. He felt insulted that an unarmed youth, or certainly a youth without any body armor, had been sent to face him. I suppose he felt a little bit like the boxer Anthony Joshua might feel if he had signed up for a world championship fight and then discovered that I was in the ring facing him. Can you imagine it? Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? He said, which is fascinating because David had a staff in his hand, obviously, that Goliath simply dismissed as a stick. Goliath couldn't see past the stick and the insult it was to him. David wisely kept his sling hidden, probably held it in his hand behind his back. So Goliath laughed and raged and threatened him, cursing him uphill, down dale, by his gods. Come here, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. All great fun, part of the convention of single combat of champions. It was a bit like an ancient version of WWF. First one hurls his insults, and then when he's finished, the other hurls insults back, and then they fight. Although on this occasion, unlike with wrestling, this was a fight to the death. But we notice that David's response was very different. He made it clear to Goliath and to the listening armies on both sides and for us exactly what this battle was really about. He said to Goliath, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, because that's where his confidence lay. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. This is the battle line. Confidence in human strength and ability and brain and brawn and technology and weaponry on one hand, and confidence in the living God on the other. Where is our confidence placed? Let's listen to David. All those gathered here, he said, will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. This is not about personality. It's not about individual courage or individual strength or military tactics. It's not brain against brawn, small against large. They're much higher and deeper things at stake in this battle. And trusting in the living God and using the skills that David had honed as a shepherd on the mountainside looking after sheep, he prevailed. And then he proceeded, when Goliath was dead, to cut off his head. Now I understand to contemporary ears that sounds rather grotesque and unsavory. But it wasn't gratuitous or meaningless. It was a symbolic statement of where the real difference between David and Goliath lay. It was not simply about size and tactics and weaponry. It was about confidence, about approach to life, about mindset, if you like. Twice in this story, we read of David referring to Goliath as an uncircumcised Philistine. Now, that wasn't an insult. It was factually true. The Philistines as a nation did not practice circumcision. But there's more to it than that, because there were other nations who didn't practice circumcision. But the Philistines are constantly referred to in the Old Testament as the uncircumcised. Israel as a nation did practice circumcision, yet on occasions even their prophets called them uncircumcised in heart. In other words, They had the physical ritual of circumcision, but not the spiritual reality which it symbolizes. And what does it symbolize? Well, Paul expresses it this way in Philippians. We are the true circumcision, he says. We who worship by the Spirit of God, who glory in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh. Now, Goliath had a lot of flesh to put confidence in. He was the biggest lump of flesh that anyone had seen. No wonder he was so arrogant, so boastful, so confident, especially when David came out to meet him. Goliath is a great example of confidence in the flesh. And sadly, Saul had proved to be like him. Saul was a Philistine at heart, but David's confidence was in the living God. That didn't mean not using his skills and with his sling. Of course he used his skill, but his confidence didn't lie there. His confidence was in the living God. Some of us have a bigger brain than others, and nothing wrong with that. Use it, I encourage you, but don't put your confidence in it. Put your confidence in the living God. I've seen bright, eager young students with bigger brains than mine, suddenly coming up against someone with a bigger brain who doesn't happen to be a Christian. And then suddenly these young students get very insecure and unsettled, because that's what happens when fundamentally our confidence lies in ourselves, lies in our own brain power, in our own ability to reason. So that rather than use our reason and our brains and trust God, we trust our reason and our brains and we use God. The real fight, the real battle, is against the mindset of the Philistine, against putting our ultimate confidence in the wrong place. As I look at this story and think back over my own life, what impacts me most is the significance of David's experience of the reality of God in his personal life, in his private life, in his daily work. Learning to trust God, getting to know him, learning to place his confidence in him, away from the huge crowds, just in the normal activities of every day. This is what equipped David to face the big public battles. In private, he faced and defeated through God's strength the enemies that came against him. He learned to take a stand for God and not to run away from a fight, even when there was no one there to see. And that was the foundation and the preparation for the bigger battles out on the public stage. These battles in his personal life developed in David a deep loyalty to God. It built up in him the unwillingness we see in this story, the unwillingness to let Goliath's opposition to the living God and defiance of the living God go unchallenged. He was prepared to fight publicly for faith in the living God because he had fought for it in his private life. I think of Paul writing to his young friend Timothy, fight the good fight of the faith. There are bad fights in life, fights that we shouldn't get involved in, but sadly often we do. But there's a good fight, the fight of the faith. There are times when we need to take our stand in loyalty to the living God. And God doesn't expect us to fight in someone else's armor. He doesn't expect us to be someone else, to have somebody else's experience of God, somebody else's gifts from God. What matters is that each of us cultivate our own experience of the living God in daily life. And that we hone the gifts that God has given to us in our circumstances, and we learn to place our confidence in the living God and fight the good fight of the faith in that part of the battlefield he has called us to.